Hi, so this is the mini lecture for Chapter 5, Understanding Psychological Measurements. So when we speak of measurements in psychology, they really are kind of a cornerstone for us to do research. Most people that are interested in psychology are interested in looking at, personality characteristics or, um, intelligence or something along those lines that's very um, intangible, meaning like we can't really observe that. We can't observe um, you know, intelligence or love. Certainly, personality, we can make inferences based upon different things, but to actually be able to give a test and say, this is your personality is a really powerful tool. So that's what this chapter kind of goes over. How does psychology handle measurements? Um, and I'm just going over some terminology and then kind of the fine-tuning process that happens with it. So first and foremost, when we look at what is measurement, so your text gives a really general definition of measurement to begin with. So assignment scores to individuals so that the scores represent some characteristic of the individual, right? Very, very general sense. It does mention, which I appreciate, that we have a special term that's typically used when we speak of psychological measurements, and that is something called psychometrics. So psychometrics is a term that I will be using really throughout this whole thing, because again, measurement can be a very broad thing, and your textbook does a good job of highlighting all the different ways that we can look at a measurement. But for specifically psychologists, again, we're very much interested in those intangible things that we can't observe happening. So we develop these scales to try to figure out, all right, how is this person scoring? How do they compare with others? Things like that. So they mention cognitive psychologists that's working with a memory task, which is great. The one about the clinical psychologist is the better one in my mind to highlight this. Right, so clinical psychologists are going to be looking at depression. So how do we decide who's actually depressed versus who isn't? One of the things that we can do is administer a psychometric scale and figure out, all right, does this person actually meet a certain threshold for what would constitute depression to the psychologist? So the Beck Depression Inventory is a really well-known depression inventory, 21 items, meaning that there's 21 questions on it. And they ultimately ask the participant to rate the extent to which he or she has felt sad, loss of energy, experienced other symptoms of depression over the last 2 weeks. Once you get all the different scores, you then add them together, and that ultimately represents their current level of depression. So it's important just to note that it does not require any particular instruments or procedures either, that there are going to be some things that you are doing just straight up observation, or it's going to be an actual test that would be considered psychometric as well. It's not the prototype of psychometrics. The prototype would be like the Beck Depression Inventory. But again, your textbook uses the example of a cognitive psychologist looking at memory. Absolutely, you can have a standard task or test that you have people physically do to test their abilities. That would still be a psychological measurement. So trying to get at this component that you can't actually fully absorb, can't fully see. So brings us into a term called constructs. So they will include a wide range of things that could be intelligence, it could be personality traits, emotional states, attitudes, abilities, pretty much all the things that we think about when we think of psychology, and probably the stuff that interests you in psychology is going to be considered a construct, right? Again, something that we can't just look at somebody and know that this is what they are. We need other pieces of information to allow us to figure that out. They cannot be observed directly, big component. And so your textbook goes into the big five here, which is, if you've taken a personality psychology class or plan to, you will read and hear all about the big five. But the big five It's essentially a personality measurement that has 5 different components to it. Now, there's certainly other personality traits that exist besides these 5, but it's a very common scale that is used. So you have openness to new experiences, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. If you want a little mnemonic to help you remember it, it spells ocean. If you read it along the side there. And these are just different facets of what we would expect somebody who scores high in any one of these components to kind of have facets of. Um, right, so extroversion is the one that most people can kind of easily know what it is. If you are scoring high in extroversion, we'd expect you to be a fairly warm individual, to be fairly assertive, to look for excitement, perhaps even thrill seeking. Right. So again, these are just facets that get along with extroversion, just like the other ones. So this is a great example of a psychometric that people take this scale. I want to say it's 44 questions, 43 questions. And based upon those questions, we then arrive at the conclusion, all right, this person is X, Y, and Z. Now, with any psychometric scale, even ones that are heavily talked about, greatly established, it does not mean that that is absolute. And we'll talk about things that can go sideways with some of the psychometric stuff, especially if you were taking them absolutely not doing any kind of cross-checking or anything like that. So operational definitions then become incredibly important for psychologists. It's the whole basis of how we can continue forth as a science, is because a big part of science is the ability to replicate. And so if we are not appropriately defining our variables and are not actually listing out how we define them, we can't replicate the studies. Just because a study looked at intelligence doesn't mean that they looked at intelligence the same way you or I might. We might kind of think, all right, intelligence, probably the IQ test, most common one, but there's certainly research out there that's looked at intelligence in other ways. There's also research out there that will look at certain subcategories of intelligence in new, novel ways. Emotional intelligence, for instance, you might be asked to look at pictures of rocks and how do they make you feel. We need to know that that's what happened. And so the operational definition allows us to know that. It is up to the researcher to come up with it. And as a researcher, it is you stating explicitly, here's how I am measuring that. And then it's up to the review committee as well as readers to decide, is that a good way of measuring it? But it has to be there. You have to figure out, what do I mean when I say attractiveness? What do I mean when I say intelligence? What do I mean when I say depression? Right? You have to state, this is how I measured it. This is what I observed. Right? Whatever it is that you did, you need to make sure to state it. So there's 3 main ways to kind of get or look at operational definitions. One is self-report measures. This would be an example of the Big Five or the Beck self-esteem scale is listed in the book, that you give a measurement to your participant, they fill it out, and then based on how they fill it out, you put them into the different categories. Now, we'd like to think people are being honest when they complete these things and they're not being swayed or biased or anything like that. This is how they truly feel about the questions. But we can't absolutely guarantee that. And so with self-report measures, there is always that concern that needs to be raised about, all right, did they actually answer that honestly? Or are they answering it in some other way? So, there's pros and cons to each one of these. That's pro and con, or the con at least. The pro to self-report is that's super easy. Just give somebody a piece of paper, ask them to complete it, and you have your data. So that's why they're so readily used. And the other pro is that there's sometimes that you need the person to actually answer things, right? That behaviorally you can't observe the behavior, whether that's due to ethical reasons, whether that's due to timing reasons, and then physiologically, which is the other one. Again, there might be ethical issues that prevent you from doing that. So self-report is your only option at times. Behavioral is where you ultimately witness a behavior and then you record it. So good example that your book uses is the Albert Bandura study known as the Bobo doll study, to where they ultimately let kids watch an adult beat up on Bobo doll. Bobo dolls are inflatable clown dolls. Typically you put like sand or water in the base, and when you punch them, they kind of go over and then they pop back up. So what they did is, all right, let's see if watching an adult beat up on Bobo ultimately results in higher aggressive levels for kids. They operationally defined aggressive levels as how many times they either hit the doll with a mallet, punched it, or kicked it, right? So they were doing a count of it, of these behavioral actions. They didn't give them a piece of paper to ask, what is your aggressive level? We can do that. There are aggressive scales out there, but they opted to do a behavior one. And then physiological involves recording a wide variety of physiological processes such as heart rate and blood pressure, galvanized skin response, hormone levels, electrical activity, and blood flow in the brain, just to list a few. A real world kind of example of this is the polygraph machine, the machine that may be used if you're a suspect in a case to detect if you are in fact lying or not. It's measuring physiological responses. It's not actually measuring, are you lying? But the idea is that if we see trends of these physiological responses, that's evidence to support that you are in fact lying. So it will measure things like galvanized skin response, which is essentially sweat, blood pressure, heart rate. It will also, I believe, measure breathing rate now, and a few other qualities that are not listed here. For any given variable or construct, there will be multiple operation definitions. And so I wanted to make sure to highlight that, that absolutely anytime you are studying really any phenomenon in psychology, people are going to look at it from slightly different angles. They're going to define things a little bit different. They're going to use different scales. They're going to use, variety of tools. They're going to use different type of procedures. All that stuff is important to know about a study that you are reviewing. All right, I'm reviewing something on stress, which is what your textbook uses here. How are they defining stress? What type of stress? Right, like all those questions should start to funnel in. And and the article should state, here's what we did. Is it their current stress levels? Did they put them through a stressful situation to get to high stress? All the research on stress that has been published is, I should say, the majority of research on stress is probably fine, not my area, but if it's been published, it's been reviewed enough times. But again, the way that any author or researcher is defining it is likely to be different. And that's going to be the case of just about any other construct in psychology, especially ones that have a lot of interest about them. There's going to be new tactics. There's going to just be new people that are deciding, I'm going to study it like this instead. So then we get to levels of measurement. And so there's 4 levels of measurement. They're nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. They're highlighted in the book. It's something that I'm guessing many of you have already come across. So I didn't want to spend a ton of time going over each and every single one. I do have them highlighted in the lecture notes as well. But essentially, nominal is the most basic level. It would be something like if you're asked what your major in college is, you would be able to categorize people based upon it, but it's just kind of words, right? Psychology, history, criminal justice, and that's how you're organizing them. Or the way that they're organized and whatnot doesn't really matter in the big sense. Whereas like something like ordinal, there typically is a rank order, right? So if you just were asked, what is your college major? And somebody just presented all the different majors there, that's going to be nominal. But now, if they were to present it in a way of what is the most taken or most stated major, you could then do ordinal, right? That you would have, all right, here's the one that got the most amount of responses, and then here's second most and third most, and you would be able to rank that. And so we call that ordinal level because the order actually matters. Interval level, this is that there's actually intervals of equal size between the different levels. So like with ordinal level, let's just say psychology was number one and you had 1,000 students that were psychology majors at this college or university. And number two was history. And history had 300 students, and number three was biology, and biology had 250. Right? The order tells us what's most and second most and third most, but the intervals between those are greatly different, right? The distance between 1 and 2 was 700 students, and the distance between 2 and 3 was 50 students. Ordinal level doesn't care about that. They're just placing them in order. Interval levels do care, and they want those intervals to be pretty much equal distance apart. So one of the big classifications of interval is that a score of 0 does not actually represent a complete absence of the characteristic. So most of the time you will see temperature used to illustrate interval levels, and that's what your textbook does as well, right? That a temperature of 0 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit does not mean that there is an absence of heat, right? That heat is still there, it's just cold. So, 0 does not truly mean an absence of. And most of the characteristics that we're going to be dealing with in psychology run into this, that, nobody has 0 personality or they'd be dead. Nobody has 0 brain function or they'd be dead, right? So most of the time we are in the interval level of, yes, we might have a 0 point, but that 0 point does not reflect complete absence. In ratio, then, this is the most sophisticated level. Ultimately, there is a true 0 point. So, there is an absence of. So, use the example of height or weight. This would be kind of more so changes that you can have 0 height change or 0 weight change. And you can get very precise with ratio scales. So again, most stuff is happening interval in psychology. So that's where you will see most of the different psychometrics using a 1 to 7 scale or even like a 0 to 6 scale. But again, the 0 does not mean complete absence. It just means very low. Okay, so then we get into reliability and validity. So reliability refers to consistency of a measure. What that means is, ideally, if a measure is reliable, it means that it's staying pretty consistent throughout time. So you might take a test one day and it tells you that you're extroverted, and then 3 years later you take a same test. Does it still tell you that you are extroverted if it's a personality test? And there's different ways that we can get reliability. So test retest is pretty much the one that I mentioned just now, where you take a test one day, take it weeks later, years later, and see, all right, did you score roughly about the same? And if you did, we would say, all right, that test has good test retest reliability. Next one, sorry, all over the place. So the next one then is internal consistency. So people agree that they're a person, so this is using a self-esteem scale. In this particular one, there is multiple questions that kind of get at the same idea. It's just phrased slightly differently, or it might just be things that we would expect to be consistent. All right, so people who agree that they are a person of worth should tend to agree that they have a number of good qualities as well. And if we're not seeing that happen, Then we have to begin to question, like, all right, what is the reliability of this scale at that point? That they're answering one way on this type of question, but other types of questions they're answering differently. Is this actually, a good measure if we're not seeing that internal consistency happen? And then the last one is inter-rater correlate or inter-rater reliability. This would be more so for if you are observing behaviors that you would have multiple kind of recorders, and ideally you would then cross-check and cross-reference. Hey, how's this ultimately going? Is this, are you seeing the same thing that I'm seeing? Things like that. So that's inter-rater reliability. The next one is validity. So extent to which the scores from a measure represent the variable that they're actually intended to. Essentially, are you measuring what you said you're going to measure? Which sounds silly, right? That, all right, if I say I'm measuring esteem, I probably am. But because of, again, nature psychology, we might think we're measuring something and really not. Like there's questions about the validity of the intelligence test. We like to think that we're measuring intelligence, but we don't actually know that for a fact, right? Like the IQ test is extremely reliable, that you will score pretty consistently across time on it. But the question of validity is brought up a lot on an IQ test. Is this actually measuring intelligence or is it measuring something else? And we don't actually have a good answer for that. It still is debated. So there's different kinds of validity, one of which is face validity. So this is just, it appears on its face to measure the construct of interest. Most people respect a self-esteem questionnaire to include items of whether they see themselves as a person of worth and whether they think they have good qualities. Yeah, right, like does it make sense, essentially, that if you were asking a person to take a depression question, is there questions that we can look at and say, absolutely, I would read that question and based upon their answer, think that this is getting at depression. Now, some scales will have just fillers, just things that do not matter whatsoever. But again, they should have where you are getting at, yes, this is actually a thing. The implicit association test is brought up in your text here, which I have you do a quiz question on. So hopefully, you can kind of look at face validity and then criterion validity, which we're going to get to. Content validity, extent to which a measure covers the construct of interest. So consider attitudes usually defined as involving thoughts, feelings, and actions towards something. This is certainly how social psychologists also view attitudes, that you have these three main components. By this definition, a person has a positive attitude towards exercise to the extent that he or she thinks positive thoughts about exercising, feels good about exercising, and actually exercises, right? So you're getting, all right, what are their thoughts, what are their feelings, and then what is their behavior? So to have good content validity and measure people's attitudes towards exercise would have to reflect all three of these aspects. Now, you don't need to, watch them exercise. You're going to ask, how frequently do you exercise, things like that. But certainly, if that's your goal, is to have a scale that's measuring the attitude that somebody has towards exercise, you need to make sure that you include questions that deal with their thoughts about it, questions that deal with feelings about it, and questions that deal with their actions or behavior towards it. Criterion validity then, extent to which people's scores on measures are correlated with other variables known as criteria that one would expect them to be correlated with. Okay, so here, it's you read through the questionnaire and ultimately you're like, okay, let's just see what people score on it. And you take their scores and you're like, okay, so in my mind, if somebody is scoring high on this variable, on this construct of interest, they should also be scoring high on this one. And you see, does that make sense? Or scoring low, that you're like, this should be opposite. So if somebody were to give a happiness scale, which we do have scales on happiness, what they score on that, we would expect to probably correlate high with, self-esteem, but low with depression scales. And that would be, criterion validity. Is it matching up how you would expect it to? So this chunk that I've highlighted pretty much just goes over that with test anxiety. But yes, so on the quiz, when it's asking about criterion validity, I want to see like, okay, implicit attitudes, you take the IAT. Now, what other things do you think could match up to test, all right, does your score truly represent your score? Whatever it happens to be, whether you agree with it or not, is the idea of that question with the criterion validity. What else could you look at or could you measure to see, is the IAT right? Right. And then discriminant validity, kind of the opposite of criterion validity, the idea that scores are not correlated with measures that are conceptually distinct, right? So again, we probably would not expect something like depression and I don't know, belief in a just world or something like that to be highly correlated with one another. So okay, how do we make sure of that? We look at discriminant validity. Example, your textbook uses self-esteem as a general attitude towards the self that is fairly stable is not the same as a mood, which is how good or bad one happens to be feeling right now. So people's scores on a new measure of self-esteem should not be very highly correlated with their moods ideally, because one's an attitude and a mood is how you're currently feeling. If they happen to be highly correlated, it would raise some concern, right? I wouldn't say that it is invalid, but you'd want to then go and do some more research on, all right, why is this happening? To see, is it my test, is it other tests, things like that. Right, and then the last section is the application side of things. So again, nothing highlighted in this section because this is kind of like, how do you actually incorporate this stuff? And ultimately, though, I do want to just talk a little bit for ideas of research proposal. So defining a construct, figuring out what it is that you want to look at and how do you narrow it down, right? An example of memory, great. It's a great concept or a great concept in psychology. But what do you want to do with it? How are you going to study it, right? Like you have to figure out, what do you mean by memory? Is it a certain type of memory? Is it memories for numbers, words? Like what is it that you're hoping to get at? And that's really the starting point for research is, I'm interested in this, and figuring out what aspects of it are you interested in. From there, deciding on an operational definition, incredibly important. What is it that you mean by memory? How are you actually going to test memory? How are you going to manipulate memory or measure memory? You have to figure that all out. Using an existing measure, this is the one that the vast majority of psychologists do, is that we look for what measures are out there and we just incorporate them into our research. But certainly there's wide varieties. You want to pick one that you're comfortable with, that you understand, that you feel is a good measure. If you come up with the end result that there isn't one, right, that I'm in new territory, this hasn't been looked at before, you then might have to create your own measure, which this was a very daunting task to do it correctly. If you just want to ask like 4 or 5 questions, you're not, from a very technical viewpoint, creating your own measure, quote unquote. You're just asking questions. But if you're actually trying to create your own measure, it is a very long, drawn out process that you booked as a decent job of highlighting. Whatever you choose, whether that's creating your own or just using the existing one, you then need to implement it, figure out, all right, where is it best to place in my study? Am I going to run into any issues with vocabulary, right? That is this at too high or too low a reading level for my participants? Things like that. That's all housed within implementing it. And then evaluating it. So, all right, now that you have your data, did your measure actually pan out? Like, not what did your participants score on it, but we also want to do something. There's an analysis called Cronbach's Alpha that lets you know, all right, what's the reliability of this? Meaning, again, what's the consistency across participant responses of the scale? And it lets you just kind of get a value, and it tells you right then and there, do you have good internal consistency in that case for this measure. All right, so with that, then that ends this little mini lecture. If you have any questions about anything, do not hesitate to ask.